Welcome to the Danish Institute at Athens. My name is Nikolaj van Eggers and I'm a postdoc at the Institute. And on behalf of the Institute, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this talk by a professor with special obligations, Mikkel Thorup, who will be talking on rogue democracy. Mikkel Thorup is a professor in intellectual history from Aarhus University in Aarhus, Denmark. He has worked a lot on the history of political and economic thought for decades now. He's the leader of a research group in the history of political and economic thought at Aarhus University, and he has worked on multiple subjects within this discipline: history of violence, legitimation of violence. He has worked on the history of the state and ideas of the state, of debt, economic relations, property, contested property claims, terrorism. Of his most important publications, I want to mention The Perversion of Reason from 2008, which is a study of reactionary thought and the counter-enlightenment tradition, an intellectual history of terror from 2010, and then UO, which is on debt from 2016. At the moment, Mikkel is working on a project, or I think multiple projects, but one of the projects is on forms of democracy and the contemporary crisis of parliamentarism, and notions of representations, the status of parties, and also fake news. And this is also the subject of today's talk, as far as I am aware. So without further ado, Mikkel.
Thank you. Well, thank you to the Institute and Nikolaj for the invitation, and thank you for coming. It's great. I should say that what I'm going to be talking about today is an endless book project that I years ago started, and there's just no end in sight. But what I'll do today is I'll present some of the theoretical framework, and then I'll, in the first half and then in the second half, I'll go into some empirical stuff or places where I think we are witnessing some very interesting and yet undecided developments. And that is what I mean by rogue democracy, a sort of transitional phase that I think we're in, where we are moving from one form of democracy into something else, which I am not prepared to say what is, because I don't know, but I think it will be something else than what we're used to call democracy. And I want to talk a bit about the various developments and contradictions that are structuring that development. But where it ends, I don't want to speculate, and it will be a point later in the talk that I don't think we should speculate. At the moment, we should just observe, I think, or I should just observe and not predict. Others can do whatever they want to do. So, the main focus of the talk tonight will be what happens to democracy when we all lose faith in parties, in representation, and in parliamentarism. And I want to argue that we are all moving away from those three cornerstones of modern representative democracy. Let me see if I can make this work. I cannot. Oh, there we go. So let's just start with a fairly simple observation, I think. We can contest it, we can debate it afterwards, but I would argue that we are living now in sort of an era of democratic fatigue. No one seems that jubilant about democracy anymore. What we are mostly focused on is all the dilemmas, all the productivities, all the idiocies, all the trumps that are inherent in present-day democracy. It seems as though, I would argue, looking at it from a long perspective, perspective, no one has ever really loved democracy. We have learned to live with it, but now we are learning to live with it a bit less. So a lot of stuff is happening right now that is centered around a discourse of democracy in crisis. Maybe the end of democracy, the amount of books that I need to read that have the end of democracy as the title or the subtitle is staggering. And that's also why I can't get any writing done, because every day a new book comes out that tells us that we are living in end times. We are living in the Walking Dead zone of this isn't a democracy anymore. I'm surprised by the amount of social science and journalistic material coming out that are predicting or just diagnosing the end of democracy. That we are either in it already or we are rapidly moving towards a situation beyond democracy. And I want to argue that is too hasty. Or rather that the thing that we are moving beyond is a specific institution of democracy, namely parliaments, but that we are keeping democracy intact. That what we should notice most of all, which is the most important, I think, observation that structures a lot of things that's happening right now, is that no one is losing faith in the idea of democracy, but they are losing faith in the practice, the current practices of democracy. And what everyone is doing is experimenting with ways in which to keep democracy alive beyond parliaments, beyond parties, and beyond the idea of representation. So I've just listed a few of the books, a few of the people who have been prominent in this prediction of collapse, this prediction also of what comes next. And again, I'm sympathetic to all the we're living in end times narratives. I love them. I love catastrophic films. It just makes perfect sense to me that we are living in near zombie times, and that just around the corner everything will collapse. I think that's a pretty sound way of going about the world. But when it comes to democracy, I'm not that convinced. I'm picking up on something else, which I think is very interesting, which is that everyone is struggling to push democracy in their direction, or they're struggling to find new ways to circumvent parliamentarism, circumvent parties, and circumvent the core principle behind modern democracy, namely representation. So I think we should pause a bit when reading all of this literature and being all depressed or being all excited as some people are. And I think we should pause a little bit, and we should think about the collapse in distinctions when we think of democracy and we really mean parliamentarism. And we should look at it both historically and in terms of what may come in the future. And we should start to develop a thinking of what democracy looks like beyond parliament. Or I would argue a lot of people are already doing that. And they've been doing it not explicitly but implicitly for a few decades, and it's picking up steam at the moment. It's radicalizing at the moment. Does that make sort of sense so far? That's sort of the main argument that I now want to go a bit into. And again, that's what I'm trying to capture with this idea about rogue democracy. That is a lot of different developments that have not one direction, but they are pushing democracy in various contradictory directions, and it's unclear where we're going, and each push in a specific direction radicalizes some values of democracy and contradicts or subverts other ideals of democracy. I'll be a lot more concrete later, but what rogue democracy tries to capture is the way in which it's very ambivalent where we're going. It's very contradictory, and it's very unpredictable where we're heading, but we are not heading towards military dictatorship, eco-fascism, or whatever it is that lies beyond democracy. We are heading towards some sort of more rough-edged democracy and a less consensual set of democratic practices that cannot be contained within the institution that we have developed around parliaments and parties in particular. All right. So when I read this literature, one of the things that I'm struck about is how benign and how idyllic they depict representative democracy. And I'm struck by another thing when reading, now we're in Athens, when reading from Plato onwards, I'm struck by all the people who say that democracy is anarchy, it's chaos, it's ruled by the wrong people. I think that's completely true. And I think that it has always been true, that in the heart of democracy there is an element of instability. And I'll give you my favorite quote of all times. I think it's the best encapsulation of what democracy is all about, and it's from the 6th American president, who in a letter that had to do with collecting coins, all of a sudden said this: "Democracy has no monuments. It strikes no medals. It bears the head of no man on a coin. Its very essence is iconoclastic." I think if one speculates, philosophizes a bit on that quote, a lot of things all of a sudden make sense. Democracy is that form of rule that cannot be substantively ordered, that has a sort of temporality, a fluidity, a changeability, a contingency built within it. And I have a lot of chairs in my, I think there's almost a chair on each slide, and that's because I am also very much inspired by another scholar, namely the French theorist Claude Lefort, who had this idea that modern politics is centered around an empty chair. Namely, that no one can occupy the chair of modern politics. No one can sit there by the lottery of birth. No one can sit there permanently. No one can be born into sitting on that chair, and no one can occupy that chair forever. So the chair is there so that one person sits there and then gets up and another person sits on the chair. But no one can occupy, no one can own the seat of power. And that is what modern politics is, and that is what modern democracy tries to institutionalize. How can you have that kind of instability and still rule? That is the challenge that I think this quote from John Quincy Adams and Claude Lefort asks us to think about. How can democracy both be stable and unstable? How is that possible? How is that very long, I think, true account of democracy as instability in essence still able to make an alliance with rulership, with stability, with decisions being taken, with consensus, and all of that stuff? That is the modern challenge. But again, nothing that democracy can do, that the democratic practice of the democratic institutions can do, will forever remove the chair, or will forever put someone on that chair. So what democracy needs to do is find a way to keep putting people on that chair and getting them out of there as soon as possible. Just think of impeachment in present-day America, or think of Game of Thrones. The hunt, the fight to sit in that chair. That is what democracy becomes all about. But again, important thing that no one can own the chair, no one can own the seat. So there's an incompleteness, there's a lack, there's an emptiness, there's an instability, there's contingency, there's something unsettled or unstable about democracy. Of course, the one big problem with Lefort is the claim that monarchies were stable, that they were substantively filled chairs, and that everyone accepted that that person sat in that chair by divine right or by birth or something like that, which is of course untrue. But there was an idea, there was a thinking, there was a monumental tradition that occupied that chair, that put people on that chair and told all of us that someone was supposed to be on the chair. Again, democracy comes in and says no one can sit in the chair for long. No one can stay in the chair. That's why one of the first things that one can detect a shift from democracy to tyranny is when the ruler tries to change the rules so he or she can sit a third term, for instance. Then you know we're in trouble, and it's just the entry point to Venezuela or something along those lines every time. But someone always wants to occupy the chair forever. All right, so if that's true, if this is something we can think with, then that is the modern challenge, the modern political challenge. And then representation, parliaments and parties coming to find a way in which to move people in and out of those chairs in a systematic, repetitive way, which both allows for a circulation of people on the chair and allows for decisions to be made. So we get a very bright and nice figure here, which I think that is the representational motor, the representational dynamic. And it comes with all kinds of problems. Basically, modern democracy is ancient Athens meets Roman Catholicism. So it's equality meets, democratic equality meets unequal representation. So the representational principle and the equality principle merges in the idea of parliamentarism. But again, the very interesting thing is that merger of a very strong principle of equality, that we are all entitled to an equal voice. And then the inequality principle, that someone is entitled to speak on behalf of everyone else. That dynamic is contained within parliamentarism. And there is a dilemma, there is a relation, there is a dialectical of sorts relation between the present that comes from being represented, that is the proximity, the similarity with one's rulers, the idea that they are like us, they are near us, they look like us, they are in a sense nobodies. They could be anyone. Anyone could sit on that throne, anyone could get elected. And the idea is that they need to look like us and be like us and think like us in order to be able to represent us. But that is, of course, only one part of it, because no one wants to be ruled by their neighbor. We all want to be ruled by someone who can do something else or who is something else than ourselves. There's an aristocratic, in a sense, principle also in the representational thought. And that is the distance that comes from needing to be represented, that we cannot speak ourselves, we cannot rule ourselves. So then we have all of a sudden a distinction. We have sort of the mystique of power. We have the distance that comes when the motorcade drives through town and the police cars in front and in the back, and then we glimpse the prime minister or the president or whatever it is far away in the distance. And in order to be able to rule legitimately, there needs to be that distance. It cannot just be one of us. He or she has to be something else. Better than us, separate from us, big personalities, whatever it is. Some distance is created there. And the argument is that representation comes in to deal with inequality in an age of equality. So in modern democratic politics, the premier value is the idea of equality, contained within the principle of citizenship. Equal voice, equal rights, equal votes, but in order to rule, in order to govern, in order to have decisions, even in order to create consensus, a distance and inequality is needed. An inequality in knowledge, an inequality in competencies, and whatever it may be, in order to make those decisions valid, efficient, and legitimate. There's a procedural hierarchy in terms of voting and representation, and there's a substantive inequality contained within bureaucratic and scientific expertise. So in both the formulation and the execution of democratic decisions, an inequality and an element of inequality kicks in. And the idea is that that has always been the case, or always, that has been the case for modern politics. And all kinds of ways have been found in order to deal with both ideals and find a balance between them. And it has worked all right. It has worked all right. And then what I'm thinking, or I'm inviting us to think about, and you may disagree all you like, I'm still semi-committed to the idea, but if everyone hates it, I'm ready to discard it at any moment. The idea is that that doesn't work as well anymore. That inequality doesn't work as well anymore, or isn't as accepted anymore. The representational distance is less accepted than it used to be. The idea that someone knows better than us is less accepted than it used to be. For all kinds of reasons, that dynamic is grinding to a halt. And it's grinding to a halt not because we are losing faith in equality, but because we are losing faith in inequality. We're losing faith in that someone knows better than us, that can govern us better than us, or that there should be a distribution of competences. We see that in science, and we see that in politics, we see that in the way in which we approach politicians and bureaucratic systems. In all kinds of small and big ways, we encounter not a total, not a complete, but a sporadic, but increasing questioning of systems of inequality, systems that work on inequality. And that means that the representative system cannot work as efficiently as it used to. Politicians are losing faith in it, they are losing capabilities. They are losing, just look at the difficulties that European governments are having in even becoming governments. And if you talk to politicians, one of the first things, once the cameras has been shut off and you have a few beers, that they're saying is that they are finding it increasingly difficult to make decisions that have any kind of effect. What they are experiencing is that they are deciding a lot of things and nothing happens or something else happens. So they're finding it increasingly difficult to govern, and we are finding it increasingly illegitimate to be governed and finding increasing ways in which to subvert that governance. So that brings forward the question of then what? If this is true, or if this is a half-truth, if this sort of points towards some developments, then what are we looking at? What are we seeing if, again, we accept the premise that what we're seeing is not the end of democracy? We're not seeing tanks in the street, we're not seeing all-out endorsement of an undemocratic alternative to democracy. But what we are instead seeing is actually a radicalization of democratic energies or democratic practices and democratic values and ideals in a non-representational way. Or to put it in slightly Clausewitzian terms, is the continuation of democracy by non-parliamentary means, or the continuation of democracy by other means. By means that are going beyond or below or above parliaments. Basically, I'm arguing that the democratic energies, both in the top and in the bottom, are becoming post-parliamentarian. So this is... I thought I had them in different slides. I don't know. So I'll give the whole game away immediately. Top, middle, bottom. Easy. All right, so let's step into some more empirical. Let's step into more concrete examples of what I'm trying to bring together, what different development I'm trying to bring into this general framework. And one of the things that I'm noticing, and one of the things I've been arguing with a lot of my, it's not that I've discovered something completely new, but it's just that I tend to argue with people who are like me, very preoccupied by neoliberalism. And what I'm trying to think about is the way in which neoliberalism is democracy by other means. That it's not undemocratic, non-democratic, anti-democratic, but it is another form of democracy. It's a different idea about democracy. It's an idea of democracy that values efficiency above legitimacy. It's a form of democratic rule that emphasizes the way in which to govern efficiently rather than through deliberative means. So that's what I have on the top as a post-parliamentary democracy. But it's not only neoliberalism. I would argue that what we're seeing right now is a set of parties pretty much across the political spectrum. Maybe Syriza in Greece is an example of someone who has radicalized that development from being outside government and now inside government, namely a shedding of the party base, because the party base has increasingly been seen as troublesome, as something that makes governing difficult. It's very difficult to be prime minister and then get the backing of your parliament, and even worse, to get the backing of your party members. So what we've seen in the last few decades throughout Europe and in the US as well, is that parties has become government parties. The parties who want to rule have shed their connections to their party base and to their civil society organizations in order to be better able to maneuver and to be better able to govern. So they have made the decision to cut the ties downwards in order to be able to rule more efficiently. And that is challenging an idea of representation, namely that the parties represent different classes, different interests, different sectors of society, and stuff like that. So they've abandoned the idea of being representational containers, if you like, in order to be able to govern more efficiently. And neoliberalism, which is the strongest sort of force within the emphasis on governing rather than democratic or parliamentary legitimacy, try, as we all, as most of us know, to insert a lot of sort of unelected rulers, mainly predominantly the market. But we could also think of independent central banks, quangos in Britain, that is sort of semi-official, semi-private entities that are doing what used to be public services. A lot of things is being lifted out from what used to be under parliamentary control and lifted out into other sectors, into other entities that are shielded, and that is the whole point, that are shielded from public view, from public input, and from public censorship. That's what I mean by, it's not the best of terms, non-democratic neoliberalism, but it's something else. And then I've added also, because it's just such a big debate, I think, at the moment, I think it's very interesting to follow the idea, the term that has been popping up increasingly in Europe, in terms of Hungary and Poland. We could add Turkey, Russia, the Philippines, Brazil, maybe the US, I don't think so, but maybe. The idea of an illiberal democracy. And I love that term because it highlights the fact that democracies do not have to be illiberal. And that historically we have often seen unliberal or non-liberal democracies. That is actually a possibility of a democracy that has democratic legitimacy, democratic channels, jealous, but that are increasingly giving up on rule of law principle or human rights protections, as Hungary and Poland are very prominent examples of at the moment. And I want to, unlike other people, mainly people who live in Hungary and Poland, understandably, I want to keep the term democracy for those regimes. I want to say that that is one of the very interesting, frightening, but interesting developments that we're seeing at the moment, which is not the same as the other ones, but has a similar component, namely a massive prioritization of the governing center at the expense of parliaments and of judiciary, of civil society. So a very strong fetishization of rulership of the governing party, of the governing principle at the expense of the other components in a liberal democracy. All right. So these are the ones that from the top are abandoning parliamentarism. Of course, they are not closing down parliaments, but parliaments are becoming increasingly inconsequential for the decisions being made, and also, and I think that's very interesting, for the legitimization of the decisions being made. So for instance, in neoliberalism, it's growth rates rather than democratic legitimacy that sustains that decision-making power. But then there's a middle section, which I think is interesting, as sort of a counter-argument or a test case for the theory I'm developing here. Namely, we have some developments that are trying to recreate parties and parliaments. And one of the interesting forces at the moment is populism. And it's all kinds of things, populism. But one of the things it emphatically is the argument that politics matters. That is the most important one line that any populist say, that is, politics matters. We can just decide to do this. We can just decide that climate change is not real if you're Trump, or we can just decide to skip human rights conventions. We can just decide to throw immigrants out. We can do whatever we like, because that is the essence of popular sovereignty. So what populism is a very interesting phenomenon that says that Parliament has been consecutively losing power. The people has lost power, and now is the time to radically reinsert popular sovereignty into the political system. Now is the time to backtrack on a development that has increasingly lost touch between governing and population. And for now, I think it's interesting that most populists stay within a parliamentary party system framework. It may be different a bit further down the line, but at the moment they are a massive, interesting, worrisome, but very interesting injection of energy into parliaments. The same in a lot and a more diffuse and a less consequential way is a lot of the new movement parties we have seen in the last few years, maybe starting with the Green parties in the 80s, then various pirate parties and the Five-Star movement in Italy, or all kinds of places where we see, or Macron, which is maybe the worst example of them all in terms of being a movement, but again, being a different kind of party, coming in from the side, not doing the traditional party building effort, but trying to create a different type of party, but exactly trying to create a party. And of course we've seen from all the movement occupation, for instance in Spain, the attempt to convert a movement into a party. Syriza, again, another example of the same. And a lot of energy being spent on trying to create a new party format. The one thing that Nikolai and I talked about today is, because he challenged me on this and had all kinds of irritating empirical counterexamples which destroy my neat thought. But one of the things that's interesting is Corbyn's Labour Party and the way in which Corbyn has become sort of a massive mobilization tool for the strengthening of the Labour Party in Britain, which is now the largest party in the Western world, doing it on the basis of very traditional 70s ways of thinking about politics, added onto a very high-tech, very fluent, very social media savvy party organization from below. So again, we're seeing a lot of people experimenting with parties, experimenting with what can a parliamentary representational system do for us. But again, I think the interesting thing is that they are very aware that the democracy as exists is defunct and corrupt, and they're trying to develop new formats. If you look at their trajectory, their development, you can see a very strong, not anti-democratic bent, but a very democratic critical approach. And an indictment of democracy as exists, and a way of trying to experiment into some new formats. But again, it's an idea that parliaments can, again, both populism and the movement parties are ideas, attempts in order to revive that parliamentary and representational format. And then at the bottom is just a collection of things that I didn't know where to fit in, which is all the interesting stuff, all the stuff that I find most interesting. And let me just, because I think I'm semi-running out of time, so let me just say something about conspiracy theories and a bit about post-truth. Because a lot of the books coming out now about the crisis of democracy will often point to these two developments as symptoms, as sign, as evidence that we are heading into troublesome times. And I would like to suggest that that may be true, but it may be completely untrue as well. Or it may be that conspiracy theories and post-truth should be seen as very ambivalent, very rogue attempts to develop new ways of keeping power accountable. So that the upsurge that we have definitely seen in conspiracy theories in the last few decades may have something to do with people desperately trying to find a way in which to keep unelected powers accountable, or keep the market, or keep that weird structure that seems to take decision on our behalf, but it's very difficult to pin down, it's very difficult to find out who actually made the decision that Facebook knows all about us. Is that Mark Zuckerberg? Probably not. It's something. And so what we're seeing is a lot of people doing crazy stuff. All kinds of weird stuff about lizard people, and we didn't go to the moon, and all of that stuff. But I think we should look beyond that. I think we should ignore that. We should ignore the facticity level and ask, what is that critical practice being developed at the moment? It may turn out to be a very dark development, but at the moment I think it's people who are zealously committed to democracy that are doing this. We may not like it, we may not find it convincing, but I think we should take seriously that these are people who think that in order to have a democracy, we need to go beyond the official narrative and find a way in which to unravel that thing that happens beyond the official facade of parliamentary politics. Oh, I have lots of time. Oh, great. Within means, okay.
Lots of time.
All right. I'm just throwing this out in the hope that when we get to the discussion round, you'll come back me on this. I would love that. So post-truth, or fighting knowledge, as I would rather like to call it, is, I think, something of the same. Although I think the consequences right now are way more troublesome. But I think this is where I started really to think about this this disappearance of the acceptance of inequality, namely a disappearance of the acceptance of inequality in competencies and in knowledge. The idea that you as an expert should not come and dictate my life. Who are you to tell me how to live my life? And who are you to establish yourself as the expert who from a neutral position can dictate the story of my life? So what we're seeing right now is a lot of challenges from all kinds of sectors, good and bad, great and completely crazy, ways in which people are self-educating, or they are challenging hitherto established knowledge authorities. And that is a development that is also contained within, or that is a structural component within modernity, but that has always been tempered by the idea especially of knowledge hierarchies. And knowledge hierarchies are at the moment on a severe challenge. Or maybe not severe challenge, but it's in a transformative mode. People are developing new ways in which to gain knowledge, exchange knowledge, create knowledge, subvert knowledge, and of course, on top of that, we have a lot of companies and politicians and spin doctors and all doing all kinds of crazy stuff with that new playing field. But I think we should again look beneath all the hype and all the worries about no one can tell fact from non-fact, and now we are living a time where everyone has their own private truth and all that, and ask what is that indicative of? What is that move indicative of? And I think what is indicative of is a growing intolerance of inequality. And again, it makes ruling, governing, decision-making extremely difficult. If every time you tell people, this is just the best idea, or this is just a fact, they say, you say fact, but I have this fact over here, so I can challenge your fact, or I can ignore your fact, or I'm not going to do that, because I've met a doctor who said something about vaccines, and I'm going with that. So again, this adds onto the unpredictability, it adds onto the ungovernability of present-day democracies. It makes the citizenry a lot more unruly. This is, in a sense, this is coming all the way back to Plato, coming all the way back to the idea of democracy as a generalized anarchy where everyone does whatever everyone wants to. Running around naked in the street, shouting their own truth, and no one is willing to listen to anyone else, no one is willing to obey a command, because no one is willing to accept that someone is above them. I'm not arguing that everyone is running around naked in the streets crying out, I have my own fact, something like that, but I hope you get the point. And again, my argument is, why is this coming now? Why is this exploding, radicalizing, accelerating now? And what are the trajectories, what are the consequences, what are the causalities of this? And I would, again, argue that this is people trying to find a way in which to live as democratic citizens in a situation where they feel that the democracy as is has turned into oppression, into a knowledge oppression, that they do not feel represented by the experts, by the people with authority, the people they have elected themselves, because they can, in a sense, self-educate them up into a point where they feel entitled, obligated to counter the official narrative, whether they be political, scientific, or otherwise. All right. 5 minutes. Okay, I won't you, Simon. I'll end now with the last chair because, I don't have anything to say about this. Just I love this picture, and I took it myself, so I'm very attached to it, and it sums up everything I wanted to say, namely that the chair has been kicked over. It's just I have something to say about it anyway. It's lying there in the tide, and the only thing we know is that the chair is somewhat there, but that it does no longer really work, and it doesn't do the magic or the illusion trick that it used to do. And in that sense, we're really in uncertain, but I think incredibly interesting times. Take out climate change, I would not live any other moment than this, because I think we are all going in different directions right now with democracy, and no one knows where it's heading. All right, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Mikkel. The floor is now open for questions or comments. I just want to combat Mikkel and a bit of ideas. Now is the time. Or afterwards in the reception. Sure. Now we'll go on to the rest of the
I hope you didn't get convinced. Yeah, great.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking you for devoting your time to this, because it's obviously